Even 3 years later, we still all get a bitter taste in our mouths when we hear the name Targaryen. That's because Game of Thrones, a show so popular that it became the most watched series in television history, ended with what is arguably the most poorly thought-out character assassination in television history. In a rushed heel turn, Daenerys Targaryen, our intelligent, ambitious, and charismatic, if controversial, heroine for 8 seasons, looked down on King's Landing from astride her dragon, went abruptly apeshit, and started to hoover the streets of the city with dragon fire, committing senseless mass murder against her own subjects. Then she was assassinated by her lover/nephew Jon Snow because, can't trust those ladies when they get power. The good news with House of the Dragon is that the beginning is the worst part. Narration launches the Game of Thrones spin-off with a quickie guide to the Targaryen dynasty. When a great council assembles to pick an heir to the Iron Throne, the narrator points out key figures. It's less dramatic than explanatory, the Harrenhal Evening News, and then on-screen text hiccups forward in time, landing us 172 years before Daenerys Targaryen. One of the first scenes of prequel series House of the Dragon seems like an apology for how badly David Benioff and D.B. Weiss did Dany dirty. Another Targaryen soars over King's Landing on Dragonback, but it's a joyful flight rather than a war crime. Safe on the ground, a young woman jumps off her mount who bears more than a passing resemblance to Emilia Clarke. This is Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, Millie Alcock, the future Khaleesi's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-aunt. House of the Dragon, created by Ryan J. Condal and Westeros mastermind George R.R. Martin, is set 172 years before the overthrow of the centuries-long Targaryen reign that kicked off the events of Game of Thrones. The first episode kicks off with a lengthy bit of exposition. The aged King Jaehaerys calls a council to decide who his heir will be, his eldest descendant, Rhaenys, Eve Best, or his eldest male descendant, Viserys. Surprise! The kingdom goes to the dude. Jaehaerys did this to prevent a civil war, because, as a voiceover warns us, the only thing that could tear down the House of the Dragon was itself. 9 years later, King Viserys I, refreshingly subtle by Paddy Considine, has enjoyed a peaceful reign. He's a genuinely nice guy, which Game of Thrones vets know means he'll probably get his head hacked off at some point. Rhaenyra is his only child, but his wife Emma, Sion Brooke, is pregnant with what the powers that be hope will be a male heir. Then everything goes fine and Emma has a healthy baby boy, and the rest of the show is just the royal fam being happy-go-lucky sweethearts. Psych. This is Westeros, dummy, and things are gonna get hairy, and bloody, real fast. Viserys sits down with his small council, led by Otto Hightower, Rhys Evans, the Hand of the King. The subject of the day is planning a jousting tournament in honor of the maybe Prince Maybirth, and it seems like these guys are really playing dice with the old gods and the new. The other big names you need to know here are Lord Corlys, the Sea Snake, Valerion, Steve Toussaint, the husband of the throne-jilted Rhaenys, and the guy who's pointedly not in the room, Viserys' little brother Daemon, who sounds like he's a lot. And boy, is he ever. The family firebrand, portrayed with slimy magnetism by Matt Smith, makes his entrance by sitting on the Iron Throne, which he most definitely is not allowed to do. Only Rhaenyra knows that her uncle is in town. You see, he's heard there's going to be a tournament in his honor. The princess points out that it's for her father's heir, and Daemon is like, yep, that's me. Rhaenyra, and the viewers, get a moment of respite when she goes to relax in the garden with her BFF Alicent Hightower, Emily Carey, who also happens to be Otto's daughter. Alicent asks if all this heir business bothers her friend, but the princess says she's happy to have someone else rule, she'd rather keep having adventures on her dragon than get repeatedly stabbed. Speaking of the metal chair, the king has an infected wound on his back that the maesters can't figure out how to heal. That will probably turn out fine. The king goes to check in on her while she's in the bath. The baby is due any day, and the pregnancy has been a rough one. Emma is justifiably worried, but Viserys says he had a dream that their son was born and everything went amazing, so it's definitely all going to be a-okay. Unlike Robert Baratheon and Cersei Lannister, by the way, Viserys and Emma seem to genuinely love each other. Meanwhile, we find out that in addition to being a drama queen, Daemon is also a sadist. He takes up his long-neglected duties as commander of the City Watch by spurring his men into cleaning up the city. And in case you were worried House of the Dragon wasn't going to have as much gore porn as its forebear, buckle up, the gold cloaks go full thin blue line on the small folk of King's Landing, slaughtering petty criminals with abandon and carting away piles of dismembered bodies. Daemon shows up at the small council the next morning proudly covered in the blood of his victims. Viserys waffles over whether the massacre was justified, but Otto isn't having it. Daemon hurls insults at the hand, and the two stare daggers at each other. Later that night, the rowdy prince has very public intercourse with a sex worker, because you knew a Game of Thrones show couldn't wait too long before doing a brothel scene. This is Miseria, Sonoya Mizuno, who is due to play a pretty major role in the series. Then it's time for the tourney, which is taking place just as Emma goes into labor. Daemon is up for the joust, of course, wearing a fabulous dragon-shaped helmet that wouldn't look out of place on Drag Race. But things get gruesome real fast, as most jousts end in the competitors ditching their horses and bashing each other's heads in. The gore gets so intense, in fact, that a young squire on the sidelines vomits in the dirt, and I almost did too.
Director Miguel Sapochnik uses this brutality to devastating effect by interspersing the night's skirmishes with Emma's harrowing labor. The Grand Maester tells Viserys it's a breech birth, meaning the king must decide whether to save either the life of his child or his wife, but not both. After weighing his options, he holds Emma's hand in his, offering comforting words as the maesters and midwives carry out the choice he's made without asking her. The sequence is gorgeously filmed and edited, but it's so graphic that it's hard to say whether it's masterful storytelling or gratuity for gratuity's sake, a question that often plagued Game of Thrones. There's something extra horrific about how Sapochnik's camera never turns away from the violence visited upon Emma's body. The knights who are beating each other to a pulp consented to their degradations, but she never did. In any case, it was all for nothing. It's only minutes after the prince is born, and named Balon by his stricken father, that he starts struggling for breath. They build a funeral pyre for the bodies of Emma and her child by the sea. An uncharacteristically grave Daemon tells Rhaenyra that her father needs her. She replies that she'll never be the son he wanted. Still, the princess steps forward and utters the first Dracarys of the series, and the king's dragon sets the bodies aflame. The small council is sharply divided over who will be Viserys' new heir. The obvious choice is Daemon, but Otto knows this is the wrong choice. The prince is a loose cannon who could drag Westeros into ruin. Then he presents an unexpected option, Rhaenyra, who, if crowned, would become the first woman to ever sit on the Iron Throne. Viserys is too overwhelmed with grief to make a choice. Luckily, Daemon makes it for him. The prince throws an orgy at the brothel for his men, and in a speech whose audience includes a couple mid-coitus, the prince toasts himself and calls Balon the heir for a day. When the king catches wind of this, he chastises his wayward brother, tells him he's chosen a new heir, and sends him packing. Rhaenyra has no idea what she's in for when her father calls her to the cellar of the Red Keep, standing before the huge skull of Balerion, the dragon their ancestors used to conquer Westeros. Viserys begins with a warning: the control their family holds over the dragons is an illusion that led to the infamous doom of Valyria, and if they forget their history, they're doomed to repeat it. Then he drops the bomb, with Balon dead and Daemon out of the picture. For now, it's her who's going to inherit the Seven Kingdoms. The lords of Westeros pledge fealty to their future queen, looking so young and lost in her royal raiment, over Viserys, delivering the rest of his message to his daughter and heir. Aegon the Conqueror, the first Targaryen king, foresaw the end of the world of men, beginning with a terrible winter. In the throne room, a stark bows to Rhaenyra. This is the blandest possible orientation, epic fantasy for dummies. Whatever Thrones was, it was never that. HBO's fantasy sensation kicked off in 2011 with extraordinary confidence in its massiveness and its mysteries, letting a snowy enigmatic butchering lead gradually into the introduction of a dozen-plus connected characters. Dragon skips that slow burn and accelerates its predecessor's late-era grandeur: big sets, big fights, big tragedies, big dragons. After the prologue, one titular beast flies skyward above King's Landing. It's ridden by 15-year-old Princess Rhaenyra, Millie Alcock, wise beyond her overlooked years. Her father, King Viserys, Paddy Considine, has spent his only child's lifetime waiting for a male heir. The Seven Kingdoms are kingdoms Viserys himself ascended after Grandpa decided cousin Rhaenys, Eve Best, was too female to rule. The scope is impressive, even when the details are shaky. Dragon centrally focuses on one location, the Red Keep, and one plotline, the King's Heir, which makes it stoggier than its far-flung predecessor. Characters constantly overhear the wrong thing around the corner. There is a horse-related fatality that is, accidentally, funny. And there is Miseria, Sonoya Mizuno, Daemon's paramour, cursed with a comical accent that reminds you how shaky Thrones could be with non-Westerosi foreignness. Two performances stand out, and a third turns extraordinary. Alcock is an outright discovery, playing a young royal with shades of over-it indifference and wounded ambition. She evokes a very Targaryen paradox, the sense that the incestuous family floats ethereally but also rains hell. Smith's Daemon is a veritable hell hurricane, bringing faint nobility to his wildcard impetuousness. By comparison, Considine seems cursed with no fun, as his king sinks under the crown's weight. The actor does so much with rueful silences, though, and lets you see how Viserys' frantic desperation to keep peace is also an eternal torment. If this first episode is anything to go on, House of the Dragon will be a more staid affair than Game of Thrones, for better or worse. So far, there are no characters as instantly appealing as Arya Stark or as funny as Tyrion Lannister. Time will tell whether the prequel will become as addictive as its forebear, and whether it will do better by its own would-be Dragon Queen.